I want to start with 3 important questions throughout this sermon series. Who am I? Where do I fit? What difference do I make? These questions have to do with identity, who we are, with belonging, where do we fit, and with purpose, what difference do we make? These are the questions that we start to ask, probably somewhere in high school, most definitely as we are becoming adults. But they're questions that we never stop asking, because every stage of life is an opportunity to evaluate who we are, who we're becoming, where do we fit in this stage of life, what difference are we making? These are central questions that are asked in a book that Pastor Taylor and I have been reading that have really helped us guide us through this teaching series. It's a book called Growing Young, and the topic of this book isn't about just attracting young people to church, but it's actually about these researchers noticed that churches that had young people in them were churches that were actually finding a way to connect the message of Jesus to every single generation. But if you're able to make Jesus real and authentic to your youngest generations, it helps the whole entire church. These are some questions I've been thinking about as I think about the disciples and how they were relating to Jesus. I think we often forget that the disciples were young. I don't know how many children's Bibles and books and paintings I've seen that the disciples have these long white beards, but they were not old. Did you notice how Jesus called them children? Children, you have no fish, have you? These disciples were teenagers and in their 20s. They were precisely at that time of life where they are trying to figure out who they are, where do they fit, what difference could they make in this world? This was a very real question for the disciples, and they had to navigate some really complex times because they started following Jesus as young men, and they had been through a lot with him. And I'll just bring you up to speed to that moment we get to where they're fishing in the sea. But they had started out as fishermen, many of them. They were young commercial fishermen, and Jesus called them to follow him, and they got to know Jesus. And as they got to know him over a period of 3 years, they came to believe that he really was the Messiah. They came to believe that he was God's son. They came to believe that he was going to do great things. And it looked like other people where they lived were starting to notice that too, because they had this entry into Jerusalem before Passover where people were waving palm branches and saying Hosanna, and they were putting their cloaks on the road, and the disciples thought, not only do we get to follow this really important man, but everybody else is starting to realize how important he is. He may become a king. He may become a warrior. He may be able to start a rebellion, and we are right here in the front row seats. But that very week that Jesus was actually welcomed into Jerusalem, a huge city, he was then put on trial. He was then sent to the cross. He was crucified, and he died. And it made those same disciples reevaluate everything that they had ever thought about him. And they also were in deep grief. And just as that was settling in, he raises from the dead. They are just in a state of confusion. And not only that, he looks different in some ways. And it never tells us in any of the biblical accounts how he looks different. It's just that when they see him, they don't quite know it's him, and it's only when he starts talking to them and interacting with them that they say, this is Jesus. So they are confused. Things are getting hard for them. They knew who Jesus was before he died, and now they're starting over from scratch, it seems. And he shows up mysteriously. He doesn't live with them anymore and hang out with them every single day. He just pops up in random places. This is a confusing time. It is hard. And they're like, I don't know how to follow the risen Jesus anymore. I don't know who I am as a disciple at this point in my life. And it's at this point where Peter says, I'm going fishing. Now, I don't want you to get the wrong idea. This is not fishing opener. It wasn't the second weekend in May in this biblical story here. It wasn't the time that my husband is just really itching for. When Peter said, I'm going fishing, it meant, I'm going back to my old way of life. I used to be a commercial fisherman. I knew how to do that. That made sense to me. I'm going back to that old way of life before things got way too complex and hard. And the other disciples said, we're going with you. So they get back in the boat. They do the thing that they know. They're at this crossroads where things are hard and they're ready to stop. It just seems easier to go back to what they know than go forward to an unknown. It's hard. It reminds me of every single time I am in my group fitness class called Body Pump. Does anybody know of Body Pump? It's a group fitness class. It's like group weightlifting. It's hard. You work, that's not me. But you work every major muscle group throughout this hour to music, and you're lifting weights, and there's someone yelling at you. And every single time I'm 2/3 of the way through a song track, I want to give up. I want to stop. And it's always at that moment where the instructor goes, don't stop. Your muscles are fatigued, but this is when the change happens. What are you doing here? Why did you come today? What do you want to get out of your workout? And in my head, I'm like, stop yelling at me. Why are you making me think existential thoughts about what I'm doing here this week and this day? But wait, what am I doing here? Oh, wait, I'm here to get stronger. I'm here to be healthy. I'm doing something good for my body. I think about that every single time as I'm simultaneously annoyed that the instructor is yelling at me, but knowing that I need that instructor to yell at me to keep going. Otherwise, I'd be like, I've done a bunch of reps. I'm probably good. That's the moment in this story where these disciples are like, we are tired. We're fatigued. We're done. And it's in that moment where Jesus shows up on the shore. And he gives them some fishing advice as well. Have you tried casting on the right side of the boat? I wonder what they were thinking. Well, no, we've only been here all night. But Jesus was somebody who was older than them, and they respected him. Even though they didn't know who it was, just out of respect, they cast the nets. And at that point, their nets were bursting. They were full of fish. And this one disciple, who we never know the name of, says to Peter, I think it's the Lord. And Peter gets so excited, he just jumps into the water rather than helping his friends bring the boat back with all the fish. And he meets Jesus in that moment. Jesus met them at a really critical time. And Jesus is also really sneaky. He doesn't say, don't go back to commercial fishing. You've got a big job to do. No, he gives them fishing advice. And then he makes breakfast for them when they come in after their fishing excursion. And maybe it was that moment where they saw him standing on the shore, that just his presence reminded him of that first time they met him when he was standing on the shore and he says, I've got an adventure for you. Come and follow me, and I'm going to teach you how to fish for people. Maybe it was his presence that they said, that's why we started doing this in the first place. And as he made them breakfast and as he served them, maybe they were all thinking, this feels familiar. Remember when we were walking alongside Jesus, when he taught us how to serve people who were hungry, when we met real needs for people, when we ministered to people who were hurting, who were tired. Maybe that act of Jesus serving them brought them back to why they were there in the first place, why they had started to follow Jesus. And maybe as they were sitting around that beach fire, he reminded them of some of those basic things about love, about God's love, about how powerful that can be, especially when things are hard, especially when you don't know how to move forward, and it's so much easier to go backwards. It's always at that point in the body pump class, too, where I want to be done, and the instructor says, remember to keep breathing. Hold your form. Don't get sloppy. It's those things that can help me keep pushing through so that I keep lifting all the way through the end of the class. Maybe Jesus' presence there reminded them to go back to the basics. Things were hard, And instead of giving up, to push through, because that's when the growth happens. That's when the change happens. In this book, Growing Young, that I referenced, they found in their research that 7 out of 10 high school students and young adults have significant doubts about God and faith. And they found that when those doubts are squashed down or minimized, that's when people lose faith, often. And it makes sense that being a young adult or being a teenager would be a time where you would start to have significant doubts. I think that would be the time where you start to wonder if the things that you learned when you were little in church school can still hold up to the complexity that you see around you in your life. You need to know that those things that you learned can expand, can grow, can be pushed on, and still be real. This is not the time to tell people, oh, don't question, don't doubt. This is the time to tell people, yeah, why is that? Let's go there. Big questions of why is there evil in the world? Where is God when I'm in pain? How does God understand and sympathize with us when God feels so far away? Questions like, I learned a lot about loving my neighbor when I was little, but now that I'm growing up, loving my neighbor is really hard. And sometimes loving my neighbor means loving my family members that are driving me crazy, and I don't know how to do that. Our questions get more complex each stage that we enter. But often at that time where we're starting to say, I don't know, let's throw in the towel, those are the times where we can have some serious growth, where we need some coaches. We need some guides. We need to see where Jesus shows up in the midst of those times. And we at this church want to be a place where people can grow in their faith, can ask hard questions, can come with their doubts, and not be turned away. In the book, they interviewed a lot of young people about what they were learning in their church, how their churches were actually helping them grow in faith. And this was one interview question that they asked a number of students. How well does your church do at helping people know the gospel or good news of Christianity? And this was one answer. Well, Christianity is the name that we gave to the gospel of Jesus, so I don't like the question. I get what you mean by the good news of the gospel, but it's not of Christianity. It's of Jesus Christ, who is the Son of God. It is not Christianity that brings the good news. It is Jesus. So as followers of Jesus Christ, we bring the good news. That was a young person in their 20s, and I think that is amazing. She was wrestling with every single word of that question. I would want any one of us to be able to wrestle and come up with what we believe and why. To be able to ask those questions, especially in times where it seems really hard to see what the answers could be. That we could be a supportive place that allows each other to grow in faith. That is a beautiful thing. That's what I hope for all of us. In the book, it says this. It says, it is not doubt that is toxic to faith. It's silence. Doubt can actually be a really important ingredient in the growth process. Because what we are about here at Good Shepherd is not following rules. We're following Jesus. And following Jesus is actually a lot harder than following rules. And when we're following Jesus, we have to help one another see where Jesus shows up. Just like Jesus showed up on the beach for the disciples who were tired, who were fatigued, who wanted to throw the towel in and go back to something old and familiar rather than keep moving forward and growing in their faith. I want us to be that place where people can push each other to grow. I want us to be able to ask these 3 questions at every stage in our lives. Who am I? Where do I fit? What difference do I make? And what difference does my faith make at this point in my life? And how is my faith influencing who I am and where I fit right now? Those are significant things that we need to think about with growth. I hope you can come back next week where we're going to talk about not only gathering and growing, but then also how do we go? How do we take this faith with us outside of these walls? Amen.